He said it just like that, with a shrug as if the words didn't carry weight. You never did enough for me. Then he walked out of my life. No yelling, no slamming doors, just a quiet, cutting exit. It was a Tuesday, late fall. I remember because the trees in the front yard had turned, and the wind kept tossing golden leaves onto my porch. I'd just taken a pie out of the oven. Pumpkin, his favorite since he was 5. I had imagined we'd sit, talk, maybe even laugh about old times. Instead, I watched my only son walk down the steps with his coat half-buttoned and his back turned. And I knew, deep down, this wasn't a fight. This was goodbye. I suppose I should back up. My name is Lorraine. I'm 67. I live in a modest 2-bedroom home in Akron, Ohio, the same house I raised Thomas in, alone. His father died in a car accident when Thomas was just 4. We were barely getting by back then. 1 income, a toddler, and medical bills I didn't understand but had to pay. I worked nights at the hospital cafeteria and cleaned office buildings on weekends. There were years I didn't sleep more than 4 hours straight. But I kept going, not because I was strong, no, but because I had no choice. I didn't date, never remarried. Every ounce of my energy went into making sure that boy never felt like he lacked anything. Birthdays were modest, but thoughtful. I sewed Halloween costumes by hand. I saved for college with coffee cans and coupons. He was my world. And I thought, foolishly maybe, that I was his too. But somewhere along the way, I became invisible. Useful, but unseen. In his teens, it started with small things, the eye rolls, the disappearing acts, the missed dinners. I chalked it up to adolescence. We all go through that, don't we? But then came college, a scholarship, and suddenly I was too small, too old, too not enough to matter. I helped with his rent when he was in grad school. He called when he needed money for textbooks, a plane ticket, new tires. I never hesitated, even when it meant skipping my own medications or putting off the heating repair. I didn't say a word. He moved to Chicago, got a good job in tech. Smart boy, always was. He started dating a woman named Marissa, sleek, polished, the kind of girl who wore cashmere and called me Lorraine instead of Mom. I smiled through every visit. Baked her gluten-free nonsense and tried not to take it personally when she scrolled through her phone at my dinner table. Then came the wedding. They said they wanted something intimate. I wasn't invited. It's just easier this way, he said on the phone, his voice stiff with embarrassment. They live-streamed it, though. I watched it in my living room, still wearing the blue dress I'd planned to wear in person. He didn't look for the camera, never waved, just kissed her and laughed with her people. Strangers to me. I cried that night, quietly, the kind of cry you do when there's no one left to see you. Still, I sent gifts, birthday cards, care packages at Christmas. When they bought their condo, I sent them a check. $3,000. That was most of my savings. I told myself it was love. That's what love does, right? It gives. But giving, it turns out, doesn't guarantee gratitude. The last time he came, he looked different, colder. He spoke in clipped sentences, kept checking his watch. I asked if something was wrong, and he smiled without warmth. You know, you always made it about struggle, about what you sacrificed. But honestly, I don't remember you being there. You were always working. You think that's love? That's just survival. I don't remember breathing after that. The air left the room. I just stared at him. He stood, grabbed his coat. I need space, Mom. Marissa and I are talking about starting a family. And I just don't want that energy around. You mean well, but it's too heavy. And that was it. He left behind the pie. And me. I sat in that silence for hours. The wind knocked a loose shutter against the house. The radiator hissed. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I made tea, just to have something warm to hold. The next morning, I opened the drawer where I kept his old report cards and macaroni art. I touched the edges of a faded photo, him at 7, missing a front tooth, arms around a snowman we'd built together. I remembered how his mittens kept falling off and how I wrapped mine over his hands, my fingers red with cold. Had I failed him? Or had he just forgotten? Either way, I knew something had shifted. A line had been crossed. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel guilt. I felt done. There's a particular stillness that comes after heartbreak. It's not peace, not yet, but it's a clearing, a space where something else might begin. I didn't know it then, but that space, that aching, hollow space, would become the birthplace of my plan. Not revenge exactly. No, that would be too easy, too small. This was about reclaiming my life, my time, my worth, and maybe, just maybe, reminding him and myself of what it really means to be enough. The days after Thomas left felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself were trying not to disturb me. I moved slower than usual, taking my time with small tasks. Folding towels, watering the plants, organizing drawers I hadn't touched in years. Grief has a way of making ordinary movements feel sacred. But beneath that quiet, something else started to stir. A faint pulse of clarity I hadn't felt in years. It came to me one morning while I stood in line at the bank. I was depositing a small retirement check, humming absently, when the teller, a kind woman named Denise, reminded me to check on my automatic transfers. "Some folks forget they're still sending money to family," she said with a laugh. "I've had people pay their grown kids' bills for years before noticing." Her words slid under my skin like cold water. I walked home with my coat zipped tight, the wind pushing me from behind. At my kitchen table, I pulled out a shoebox where I kept important papers. Receipts, old bills, warranty slips, tax returns. I hadn't looked inside it for a long time. I found envelopes from Thomas, checks I had written, bank statements showing transfers to his accounts. Pages and pages of it. Years of quiet giving. There it was in black and white. Rent payments from his grad school apartment, the deposit for his Chicago condo's closing costs, even a stack of receipts from a furniture store where I'd helped them buy a couch. They had picked the expensive one. I had put it on my credit card. I don't know why I kept every document. Maybe because somewhere deep down, I knew I would need proof one day. Proof that I wasn't imagining my effort. Proof that I had shown up. That night, I slept restlessly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas's face. Older, sharper, saying those words. "You never did enough." On the third night, I woke suddenly at 3:07 a.m. The power was out, and the hum of the refrigerator had gone quiet. Something in that silence snapped into place. I sat up in bed, breath shaky but resolute, and whispered to the darkness. I was there. And in that moment, the idea of a plan no longer felt vindictive. It felt necessary, like setting a broken bone straight. Still, I didn't move quickly. Age teaches you patience, teaches you not to rush when emotions are loud. I started by taking walks around the neighborhood, letting my thoughts settle into something steady. I visited the library, sat in the warm reading room, and read about boundaries, what they mean legally, emotionally, financially. I spoke with a volunteer at the senior center about estate planning, not because I was dying, but because I was finally living for myself again. I realized something simple. I had no obligation to keep Thomas afloat. I had no obligation to leave him anything. Love had made me blind to that truth. One afternoon, as I sorted through another stack of papers, I found the last check I'd written him, $750 for emergencies. He had cashed it 2 days before telling me I was never enough. I held the carbon copy in my hand until my fingers went numb. The ink had smudged slightly, as if the paper itself were ashamed. That was the day I stopped crying. Later that week, while sweeping the porch, I overheard 2 teenagers arguing on the sidewalk. One accused the other of using him, of only showing up when he needed something. The boy snapped back. "Then stop letting me take from you." I don't think he meant it philosophically, but those words hit me straight in the chest. Stop letting it happen. When was the last time I had done anything just for myself? When had I last bought something I wanted instead of something Thomas needed? I looked around my home and saw the evidence. Frayed curtains, chipped mugs, a sofa cushion flattened by decades of use. Meanwhile, my son lived in a condo with marble countertops and heated floors. I took a deep breath, tasting the cold air as if it carried a message. This wasn't about hurting him, it was about waking myself up. I decided, quietly and without drama, that I would draw a line, a permanent one. And if Thomas ever came back, if he ever chose to look me in the eye and see the truth, that line would be there, steady and unshakable. But before I could move forward, I needed to face one more thing. The aching part of me that still hoped he would call, apologize, say he didn't mean it. That hope was a chain, and breaking it would require a strength I wasn't sure I had yet. Still, the first spark of my plan had formed. It glimmered faintly but unmistakably, like the warm light under a closed door. All I had to do now was open it. The first real turning point came on an ordinary Thursday morning. The kind of day that passes unnoticed unless something inside you shifts while the world isn't looking. I was pouring myself a cup of coffee when the phone buzzed on the counter. Not a call. A notification from my bank. Automatic transfer completed, $450. For a moment, I just stood there blinking at the screen. I had canceled every recurring payment to Thomas weeks earlier. Or at least, I thought I had. Apparently one had been set through an older online form, buried deep in the account settings. My hand tightened around the mug. Not out of anger, but out of something sharper. The realization of how long I'd been moving through life half asleep, letting things happen to me instead of choosing them. I set the mug down and opened my laptop. The sun was just beginning to spill through the blinds, lighting the dust in the air. I clicked through screens, passwords, verification codes. When I finally reached the old transfer schedule, I saw dates stretching back years. Quiet little withdrawals, quiet little disappearances. Have you ever noticed how truth doesn't arrive with trumpets, but with small numbers on a screen? I printed the transaction history. The paper came out warm, lines of ink forming a story I had been living but never reading. I placed it on the dining table next to the other documents. Copies of checks, old texts where Thomas asked for just a little help. Emails with subject lines like urgent and the mom plas respond. The more I looked, the clearer everything became. I wasn't just grieving a son. I was grieving the woman I had been, the one who believed love meant limitless giving. I sat there until late afternoon, the light shifting from gold to gray. When the street lamps flickered on, I made a decision. I would talk to someone who understood the language of paperwork better than I did. The next morning, I took a bus downtown to a law office recommended by the senior center. The building was tall and glassy, with a lobby that echoed faintly when I walked across it. The receptionist spoke gently, as if she could feel the tremor in my voice when I asked if any attorney was available for a brief consultation. A few minutes later, a woman in her 40s stepped out. Dark blazer, steady eyes, a quiet confidence that put me at ease. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Attorney Harris. Come on back. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh paper. I handed her the folder I'd compiled. She read in silence, flipping through each page with practiced calm. When she finally looked up, she didn't speak right away. She studied my face as if trying to understand not just the facts, but the story behind them. Are these all voluntary contributions you made to your son? She asked. Yes, I whispered, hearing the shame tucked inside that word. She nodded slowly. And you're not seeking repayment, correct? I shook my head. That idea had never crossed my mind. Repayment wasn't the point. My freedom was. What I want, I said, is to make sure nothing else leaves my account without my permission. And I want to rewrite my will, remove him. Her expression didn't change, but something softened in her eyes. Not pity, recognition. That is fully within your rights. You have control over every dollar you earn, every decision about your estate. No one, not even family, is entitled to those choices. The relief that washed over me was unexpected. Quiet, but deep, like finding a door inside a house you thought you had fully explored. She drafted the necessary documents, authorization blocks, account protections, a new will. She explained everything in patient detail, sliding pages toward me with sticky notes marking where to sign. I felt the weight of each pen stroke as if I were carving new boundaries into the world. Before I left, she touched the folder lightly. You've done more than enough, Mrs. Whitfield. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Outside, the wind had picked up. My coat fluttered as if trying to lift me forward. On the bus ride home, I watched people through the window. A young mother helping her toddler off the curb. 2 high school boys shoving each other playfully. An older man adjusting his glasses as he read a newspaper. Lives overlapping, none of them aware of the woman in seat 14 who was quietly reclaiming herself. When I reached my stop, I stepped onto the sidewalk with a steadier gait than I'd had in years. The grocery store sign buzzed faintly. A dog barked from behind a fence. Ordinary sounds, but they felt new. That evening, I placed my newly signed documents in the drawer where my old memories used to live. It felt symbolic, somehow, like placing a stone where a wound had been. Did you ever realize too late that you were being used? I asked myself that question as I sat in the living room, listening to the low rumble of distant traffic. But instead of regret, I felt something gentler rising in my chest. A beginning. I didn't know what Thomas would do when he discovered the changes. Maybe nothing at all, maybe everything. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. It steadied me. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly, almost politely, like a letter slipped under my door. I was trimming the faded hydrangeas in the front yard when my phone buzzed. A voicemail from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Emily from Lakeshore Pediatrics Billing Department. Mrs. Whitfield, we're following up regarding the outstanding balance for Thomas Whitfield's recent visit. Our records show you as the secondary financial contact. Please return our call. I stood there with the pruning shears still in my hand, a petal caught on my sleeve. Thomas hadn't spoken to me in weeks. He certainly hadn't listed me for anything recently, or so I thought. Inside, I sat at the kitchen counter, heart knocking gently against my ribs as I dialed back. Emily answered cheerfully. I explained who I was. She checked the file. Yes, you're listed here on the financial authorization form. Would you like to pay the remaining balance of... No, I said softly. I would not. She paused, surprised. Should I remove your authorization then? Please do. A few keystrokes clicked through the line. That was it, something that had existed for years, a tether I didn't even know was there. Vanished just like that. But it made me wonder, how many invisible strings had I been tied to, all this time. That evening, I opened the drawer where I kept old files and sorted through every document I could find. Medical papers from when Thomas was a teenager, old school forms, emergency contact sheets I'd signed without thinking. My name appeared again and again like a watermark, somewhere between the stack of immunization records and the faded high school permission slips. I realized how often my presence had been taken for granted. Legally, financially, emotionally. I had been the default solution for every inconvenience in his life. But now that I had stepped back, my absence was starting to make noise. A week later, another call came, this time from a bank in Chicago, asking to confirm whether I would be co-signing a refinancing application for Thomas and Marissa's condo. My name had been pre-filled from an old file. I felt a sting behind my ribs, not of anger, but of clarity. This wasn't maliciousness. It was habit. The habit of relying on a woman who no longer existed. "I won't be co-signing anything," I said calmly. "And please remove my name from your system." The representative hesitated. "Of course, ma'am. I'll make the update." When I hung up, I noticed something interesting. My hands weren't shaking, not even a little. Later that afternoon, I swept the living room floor, letting the broom glide beneath the sofa where dust liked to hide. My mind wandered to the years when I'd rush home from work to make sure Thomas ate something healthy, when I'd stay up late filling out college forms while he played games in his room. The devotion had been genuine, but so had the exhaustion. As the sun lowered and cast warm stripes across the hardwood, a soft knock came on my door. I opened it to find my neighbor, Ruth, holding a small container of apple butter she'd made. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently. "Just checking in." We sat at the table, sipping tea. I didn't tell her everything. Some wounds are too fresh for public airing. But I mentioned that I'd been dealing with financial entanglements with my son. Ruth nodded knowingly. Kids forget their parents have limits. They think we're built from endless reserves. Her words wrapped around me like a quilt, not comforting exactly, but warming. The next day, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. At the edge of the park, a father bent to tie his daughter's shoes. She giggled, grabbing his hat and placing it crookedly on his head. He corrected it, laughing. A memory rose unexpectedly. Thomas at 5, sitting on a curb, holding out a shoelace he couldn't manage. His cheeks flushed with frustration. I had knelt, tied it carefully, and kissed the top of his head. He had leaned into me then, trusting and small. That boy was gone, and maybe he had been gone much longer than I allowed myself to admit. When I turned to go home, the air felt different. Sharper, cleaner. I understood then that letting go wasn't a dramatic act. It was a series of tiny choices, quiet refusals, me saying no to a world that had forgotten I had the right to. That evening, I reviewed my new will again, reading each clause slowly, not out of uncertainty, out of respect for the woman who had finally learned how to protect herself. I placed the document in a fresh folder, labeled it clearly, set it in the drawer with a sense of finality. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was a boundary. A simple, unwavering boundary. And in that clarity, a small, steady strength began to grow, the kind that doesn't shout or tremble, but simply holds. The real shift, the one that settled silently into my bones, came the morning I finally stopped waiting for Thomas's apology. I didn't wake up intending to. It just happened, the way dawn arrives whether you're ready or not. I was in the hallway closet, searching for my winter gloves, when I found a cardboard box labeled, "For Thomas Important." I remembered packing it years ago thinking I'd give it to him when he was older, when he might finally care about the pieces of his childhood I'd carefully preserved. Inside were things only a mother would keep, His first library card, a crayon drawing of us holding hands under a crooked tree, the registration form from his first swimming lessons, a tiny sock with a sewn-on patch I'd repaired in the middle of the night after he tore it on the playground. But tucked beneath it all was something I hadn't seen in ages, a letter from my late husband, Daniel. He had written it 2 weeks before the accident, scribbled during a lunch break, folded into a shape that hadn't been opened in decades. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. His handwriting leaned heavily to the right, rushed but warm. Lorraine, if anything ever happens to me, promise me one thing. Don't let your kindness become a weight. People will take from you because you give so easily. But you deserve a life that fills you, not empties you. Protect that life. For you. For our boy, too. I had forgotten those words, or maybe I had buried them under years of survival. I pressed the letter to my heart, feeling the ache of a love that had carried me through the hardest years. Daniel had seen this future, the imbalance, the quiet erosion, before I ever understood it myself. I sat on the floor until my knees stiffened, thinking about what it meant to protect a life. I had spent so long preserving Thomas's path that I had nearly erased my own. For the first time in years, I closed the box not with sadness, but with clarity. I returned it to the closet, not as a gift for a son who no longer wanted these memories, but as a part of my history, one I finally accepted belonged to me. Later that afternoon, I brewed a fresh pot of tea, letting the steam fog the kitchen window. The house was quiet, except for the occasional ticking of the wall clock. I glanced at it. 2:14 p.m. This was usually when Thomas would text, asking for something, proof of insurance he couldn't find, a copy of his birth certificate, my social security number, for a form, money, just until payday. But the phone stayed still, and for the first time, the silence didn't sting. I decided to clean the small desk where I handled my bills, though what I was really doing was preparing for a new chapter. I shredded expired documents, filed receipts, updated passwords. It felt oddly empowering to make order out of chaos, to reclaim the quiet details of my own life. As I worked, I found a voicemail from Thomas. Not from today. From months ago, one I must have forgotten to delete. The message was short and impatient. Mom, where's that tax transcript you said you'd find? I need it today, not next week. Please try to be quicker. I listened to it only once before pressing delete. Not out of anger, out of release. Words spoken in entitlement didn't deserve a permanent home in my memories. Later that evening, I stepped outside to take the trash to the curb. Ruth was walking her dog and waved. "You look lighter tonight," she said with a knowing smile. "Maybe I am," I said. "Maybe I finally remembered how to stand up straight." She laughed warmly. "Good. You deserve that." When I went back inside, the house felt warmer somehow. I curled up on the living room sofa with a soft blanket and turned on the small lamp beside me. The room glowed with a gentle gold, the kind of light that makes the world feel safe again. I thought of Daniel, of the years I'd held everything together with pieces of tape and hope, of all the moments when I felt invisible but kept moving anyway. And I realized something simple and powerful. I had survived the hardest parts of my life without recognition, without applause, without anyone telling me I was enough. Yet I had endured, quietly, steadily. And now I was building something new, a life chosen, not defaulted into. Outside, a car passed by, headlights gliding across my window like a slow-moving comet. The night settled back into stillness. My breathing matched it. I didn't need Thomas's approval anymore. I didn't need his gratitude or validation. What I needed, finally, was myself. As I turned off the lamp, the house drifted into darkness. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. I didn't expect the knock on my door that morning. It was early, too early for visitors, and the sun was barely lifting over the rooftops, turning the frost on the grass into a shimmering silver sheet. I tightened my robe and opened the door to find Officer Miller standing there, his breath clouding in the cold. He wasn't a stranger. He'd been to our neighborhood meetings a few times, always polite, always calm. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, gently touching the brim of his hat. "May I come in for a moment? Nothing urgent, just a matter we need to clarify." My heart fluttered, but I stepped aside and led him into the living room. The radiator hummed softly. I gestured for him to sit. He remained standing. "We received a report from a financial institution in Chicago," he explained. "They contacted us because your name was removed from several authorizations to access accounts connected to your son. They just needed to confirm that the changes were made by you and not the result of fraud." I nodded, steady. "They were made by me." He studied my face with a look I recognized. Not suspicion, but concern. "Everything all right, ma'am?" For a moment, I considered brushing it off, giving the easy answer women my age are so good at. But something inside me, something newly awakened, refused to shrink. "Yes," I said softly. "Everything is all right now. I'm simply reclaiming what's mine." He nodded, understanding more than I had spoken aloud. I handed him the folder Attorney Harris helped me organize, the notarized will, the authorization removals, the signed account protections. He scanned each page with professional attention. "Looks perfectly in order," he said, handing the folder back with care. "If your son questions anything on his end, he'll be informed these changes were made legally." A small tremor passed through me. Not fear, but the echo of old conditioning. The part of me still bracing for Thomas's disapproval as if it still had power. Have you ever felt that? The old version of yourself tugging at your sleeve, begging you to stay small? Officer Miller's voice grounded me again. "You did everything by the book," he said quietly. "You'd be surprised how many people feel guilty for protecting their own boundaries." I offered a thin smile. I suppose I was one of them. He left a few minutes later, boots crunching across the frosted walkway, leaving behind a strange silence. Heavy, but clean. After closing the door, I leaned against it and let out a long breath. This was real now. Irreversible. Documented. It was no longer just a private shift in my heart. It was a legal acknowledgement that my life was no longer tied to Thomas's demands. Later that day, I walked to the post office to mail a few papers back to Attorney Harris. The air was crisp, and the sky a pale winter blue. As I waited in line, I watched a young man struggle with a stack of envelopes, dropping them twice before managing to keep them balanced. He laughed awkwardly, glancing around as if expecting someone to swoop in and help. That used to be me, swooping, fixing, cushioning the fall before it even happened. But I stayed still, hands folded on my own envelope. Not out of coldness, but out of recognition. People learn by carrying their own weight. The clerk stamped my documents, slid them into the outgoing bin, and asked if I needed anything else. I shook my head. Walking home, I felt a subtle weight lift. Not the dramatic release I once imagined healing would bring, but something quieter, like a knot gently loosening. That evening, rain tapped against the windows. I sat in my armchair, a soft blanket around my legs, watching the streetlights reflect on the wet pavement. My home felt different in the dim glow. Fuller, somehow, even though nothing had changed except me. I thought about Thomas, about how he might react when he learned he no longer had financial access, no longer stood to inherit anything from me. Maybe he would panic. Maybe he wouldn't care. Maybe Marissa would be the one to push him into calling. But the truth settled over me like the rain's rhythm. Whatever he felt was his to feel, not mine to fix. Have you ever reached a moment when you finally stopped carrying someone else's consequences? It's strange, liberating, a little frightening, but mostly, it feels like stepping out of a long, dark hallway into a room filled with soft light. I tucked the blanket closer and let my eyes drift shut. The storm outside lulled me into a peace I hadn't known in years. And somewhere deep inside, something whispered, "You're almost free." The call came on a gray Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low enough to brush the tops of the trees. I was kneading dough for a small batch of cinnamon rolls, a habit I'd kept even after Thomas stopped visiting. The radio hummed softly in the background when my phone lit up with his name. I didn't answer. Not at first. For weeks, I had lived inside a newfound quiet, a life shaped by my choices instead of his expectations. But seeing his name reminded me of an old reflex, the quickened pulse, the urge to fix, to soothe, to shrink so he could grow. I wiped my hands on a towel and stared at the phone until the ringing stopped. A minute later, a voicemail notification appeared. I let it sit there, like a sealed letter I wasn't ready to open. Instead, I returned to my dough, pressing my palms into it gently, grounding myself in the familiar rhythm. By the time the rolls were rising on the counter, I felt steady enough to listen. His voice sounded strained, thinner than usual. "Mom, I just found out about the bank stuff. And the will. This is a lot. I don't understand why you'd do something so extreme. Can we talk? Please call me." He sounded confused, almost wounded. Not angry, that surprised me more than anything, but I knew better than to trust the surface of his voice. Thomas had a way of using confusion like a net, wide, loose, meant to catch me before I saw where I was being pulled. I placed the phone face down and opened the window slightly. The damp air drifted in, carrying the scent of rain on pavement. My kitchen felt small, but safe, like a warm pocket in a world that was suddenly too large. Later, while the cinnamon rolls baked, I replayed his message. Not for guidance, for clarity. And what I heard was unmistakable. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what led to my decisions. He didn't ask how he could repair our relationship. He asked why I had removed access, why I had rewritten my will. He asked what affected him. I turned off the radio and let the silence settle. The truth was becoming clearer by the day. Thomas didn't want connection. He wanted access. That evening, after dinner, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my lap. The streetlights flickered on one by one. A few kids rode their bikes past, laughter echoing in the cool air. Ordinary, gentle sounds. I breathed them in. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. "Mom, seriously, call me." I didn't. The next morning, I walked to the little cafe near the library. I ordered chamomile tea and a toasted English muffin and sat by the window. The barista, a kind young man named Jack, asked if I wanted my usual, quiet table. I smiled, grateful that someone noticed my habits without expecting anything from them. As I sipped my tea, I wrote in my small notebook, something I'd started doing since the changes began. Not diaries, not confessions, just observations. Today I wrote, "I am not required to return to the life that hurt me." Across the cafe, a woman my age laughed with a friend, her hand resting casually on a paperback novel. She looked free, ordinary, in the most beautiful way. I didn't envy her. I simply realized I could be like her. On my walk home, I passed the community board outside the grocery store. A flyer caught my eye. A watercolor class at the senior center, Tuesday mornings. I used to paint in my 20s, back when Daniel and I dreamed about little hobbies we'd take up when life got easier. It never did. I folded the tear-off tab into my coat pocket. When I returned home, a new voicemail waited. This one sounded sharper, the edges of his patience fraying. "Mom, I talked to Marissa. She thinks maybe you're confused, or someone talked you into this. We can figure it out. But I need you to call me. This isn't like you." But it was like me. The new me, the one he had never bothered to meet. I sat at the dining table, phone in hand, feeling a familiar ache settle in my chest. Not grief, not guilt. Something quieter, like mourning a story that could no longer be told. I whispered into the empty air, "I don't belong to you anymore." The house didn't echo it back, but it didn't need to. That night, as I prepared for bed, I finally felt something shift in my understanding. I hadn't cut Thomas off. Not emotionally, not spiritually. I had simply stepped out of a role he still wanted me to play. And he was calling, not to reach me, but to pull me back into it. But I wouldn't go. Not this time. Not anymore. I slipped under my quilt, listening to the soft tick of the clock on the dresser, and let my breath fall into a slow, steady rhythm. Freedom, I realized, was a quiet thing. So quiet, you almost miss it, until you finally choose it for yourself. The next week unfolded with an almost unsettling calm, the kind that makes you look over your shoulder even when nothing is there. Thomas didn't call again for several days. The silence felt deliberate. Not respectful, but strategic, like he was waiting for me to grow uncomfortable enough to reach out. But the discomfort never came. Instead, I went to the watercolor class at the senior center. The room was bright, the tables covered with newspaper, the air humming with soft chatter, and the faint smell of acrylics. A woman named Janet showed me how to mix color with more water than I remembered using in my youth. Another woman, Ruth Ann, told me my brush strokes looked hopeful, a word I hadn't associated with myself in a long time. For an hour and a half, no one needed anything from me. No one expected me to solve a problem. No one asked for money or paperwork or last-minute favors. I just dipped a brush into a pool of blue and watched it bloom across the paper like a quiet sunrise. When class ended, I walked home with paint on my fingers and a lightness in my chest that felt almost foreign. 2 days later, the first message from Marissa arrived. It was a long text, wrapped in the kind of politeness that feels sharper than anger. "Hi, Lorraine. I'm sure you're overwhelmed or confused, but removing Thomas from your will and cutting all financial ties seems unnecessarily harsh. We're trying to understand what you're going through. Please respond." What I was going through. Those words made me pause in the middle of the kitchen. The kettle hissed behind me. Almost angrily, I read her text twice, then a third time. It wasn't concern. It was control dressed as compassion, a familiar pattern. I didn't reply. That afternoon, I met Ruth for a walk around the block. We didn't talk about heavy things. Instead, we chatted about her dog's newest bad habits and the community garden project starting in spring. But at one point, she looked at me, her gaze steady. "You seem stronger," she said. "Not louder, just firmer." I smiled. "I feel like I've been underwater for years, and I finally came up for air." That night, the phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail, knowing exactly whose voice would be waiting. "Mom, it's me. I don't understand why you're shutting me out. I'm trying here. You could at least talk to me." He sounded frustrated, but underneath it was something else. Disbelief. The realization that the person he'd taken for granted was no longer available to absorb his needs. I sat on the couch listening to the furnace rumble softly and realized something important. I didn't hate him. Not even close. What I felt was sadness for the years neither of us could rewrite. The years where I taught him, unintentionally, that my needs did not matter. The next morning, as I sifted through old recipes looking for one I'd clipped from a magazine decades ago, I found another relic, a note Thomas had written in elementary school. To Mom, you always fix everything. It was meant as a compliment back then, a testament to childhood trust. But now, reading it with older eyes, I felt something shift. I had fixed everything, until there was nothing left of me to fix. That evening, the phone rang once more. This time, I picked it up. Not to answer, but to silence the ringer. I wasn't ready to talk, and I didn't owe immediacy to anyone who had not offered it in return. Instead, I baked a small lemon loaf, letting the bright scent fill the house. I cut a slice while it was still warm and sat by the dining room window watching as dusk softened the edges of the neighborhood. For the first time, I noticed the small, gentle details. The way the street lamp flickered before settling into a steady glow, the faint sound of a neighbor's radio drifting from an open garage, the silhouette of a cat perched on a fence like a quiet guardian. Life was happening around me, full and ordinary and beautiful, no longer overshadowed by the gravity of someone else's demands. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, the thought came to me clearly like a line spoken in a quiet theater. This is what reclaiming yourself feels like. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady, unshakably steady. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. No new messages, no new guilt waiting for me. I placed it on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and sank beneath the quilt. Not avoiding anything, but allowing myself to rest in a life that finally felt like my own. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of it. The Tuesday of my meeting with Linda arrived cold and windswept, the kind of morning where the world feels stripped down to its essentials. I drove into town with my gloves tucked beneath my thighs to warm them, the heater humming as my thoughts drifted in slow, steady currents. Outside the windshield, the bare branches of winter trees blurred into dark strokes against a pale sky. Linda's office sat on the third floor of a red brick building that used to be a textile mill. The elevator was old enough to rattle but kind enough to bring me up without protest. At the door, her assistant greeted me with a warm smile and handed me a small cup of herbal tea, steam rising like a delicate veil between us. "She'll be right with you, Mrs. Whitfield." I nodded, settling into the waiting room chair. On the wall hung a watercolor painting, soft blues and greens blending into the outline of a shoreline. It reminded me of my class at the senior center, the quiet joy I'd felt watching color bleed into paper with a will of its own. Linda appeared a few minutes later, crisp and calm in her slate gray suit. "Eleanor," she said with genuine warmth, "come on back." Her office smelled faintly of cedar and ink, a combination I'd always found grounding. She gestured for me to sit and closed the door softly behind us, before taking her seat across the polished oak desk. "I read through your message," she said, "and I reviewed the latest receipts you forwarded from the wedding. Before we make any adjustments to the estate, it's important that you feel completely clear about what you want and why you want it." I appreciated that about Linda. She never rushed decisions or allowed emotions, however justified, to lead people into choices that couldn't be undone. She waited, patient as stone. I reached into my bag and set down a folder thick with printed invoices, credit card statements, email chains, all stamped with my name. "This," I said softly, "is the part they don't see. They accept it, expect it, but somehow it disappears in their memory, as though generosity evaporates the moment it's given." She leafed through the documents with careful fingers. Her expression remained composed, but there was a subtle tightening in her jaw that told me she recognized the pattern. When you emailed me yesterday, she said, you mentioned wanting to revise the structure of the inheritance. Are you certain this isn't simply a reaction to the wedding? No, I said. It's a recognition. The wedding just focused the lens. She nodded once, understanding. For years, I continued, I've given freely and willingly. Not just money, time, stability, the lake house, the future I imagined for them. And yet, I wasn't simply overlooked. I was edited out, as though my existence didn't quite fit into their new picture. Linda folded her hands. What changes do you feel ready to make? I inhaled slowly, letting the air fill every part of me before I spoke. I want to remove Ashley from the contingency trust, entirely, and I want the allocation to Michael adjusted so that the bulk of the estate, everything except a modest percentage, goes into a charitable scholarship fund instead. Linda raised an eyebrow slightly. For first-generation students, as you mentioned last year? Yes, I said. For kids who never had anyone to open doors for them, for those who carry their lives on their backs and walk forward anyway. She smiled gently, approvingly. It's a generous vision. It's a necessary one, I murmured. We spent over an hour reviewing documents. As Linda drafted revisions, she explained each change in language that was precise but still human, words designed to protect my intent long after I was gone. When we finished, she slid the new estate plan across the desk. All that remains, she said, is your signature. Once signed, I'll notarize, file, and distribute sealed copies to ensure enforceability. I looked down at the crisp pages. So many years reduced to clauses and percentages, assets and directives. Yet for the first time, the paperwork didn't feel like the sum of my life. It felt like a direction, a decision, a turning of the page. I signed where she indicated. Each stroke was deliberate, almost ceremonial. When I finished, Linda notarized the documents with a firm, echoing stamp. Eleanor, she said, meeting my eyes, I want you to understand this clearly. You are not doing anything cruel or unfair. You are setting boundaries in the only language some people respect, legal and financial clarity. I exhaled, relieved by the truth of her words. Outside, the wind whipped my coat around my legs as I walked to the parking lot. The air bit at my cheeks, but something inside me felt warm, renewed, anchored. On the drive home, a call from an unknown number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. When I got home, I braced myself before listening. Ashley's voice, bright and brittle, spilled through the speaker. Eleanor, hi. I heard from Michael that you've been making changes. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We should talk. We're family now, after all. Family, an easy word to say, harder to live honestly. I deleted the voicemail and placed my phone in the drawer, not out of avoidance, but preservation. That evening, while stirring a pot of vegetable soup, I felt a quiet sense of rightness settle around me like a shawl. My house hummed with its familiar sounds, the dishwasher clicking, the faint whistle of wind through the window frame, the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. These weren't reminders of solitude. They were companions of peace. I ladled soup into a bowl and carried it to the kitchen table. The seat across from me sat empty, but not painfully so. For once, I didn't imagine anyone there. I just ate, savoring each warm bite. After dinner, I sat at my small writing desk with a sheet of thick stationery. I wrote a letter to Michael, not out of anger, not to justify myself, but because I needed to say what I knew he couldn't yet hear. Dear Michael, there may come a day when you ask why the estate changed, why the trust shifted, why the future looks different from what you expected. When that day comes, I hope you remember that a mother's love is not measured by the money she leaves behind, but by the lessons she hoped her children would carry. The most important of those lessons is simple: Respect is not optional. It is foundational. Mom. I placed the letter in an envelope and tucked it in the binder where Linda's documents now lived. Maybe he would read it someday. Maybe he wouldn't. But its presence steadied me. The next morning, sunlight streamed across the rug in soft gold ribbons. I opened the blinds and let the light flood the room. It felt symbolic somehow, an invitation to a life no longer overshadowed by unspoken debts or expectations. Later, I took a walk through town. The bakery smelled of fresh bread. The florist was setting out winter arrangements of pine and eucalyptus, and the sidewalks were dusted with a thin layer of early frost. Everything ordinary, everything beautiful. As I passed the community board, a new flyer caught my eye, a volunteer mentorship program for local youth. I paused, reading the small paragraphs outlining responsibilities. Tutoring, listening, supporting at-risk students through college applications. My heart stirred in a quiet, unmistakable way. This was the kind of giving that replenished instead of draining, the kind that created connection instead of erasing it. I tore off a contact slip and tucked it safely into my coat pocket. The day passed gently. I painted for an hour, losing myself in shades of deep green. I called Ruth to check on her dog, who'd gotten into a box of cereal the night before. I reorganized the pantry, finding ingredients I'd forgotten I bought. The world moved, not quickly, but meaningfully. That evening, as twilight settled like a soft blanket over the rooftops, another message came in, this time from Michael. Mom, I'm not sure what's happening. Ashley says we should come by to talk. Please respond. I read the words slowly, studying them not as a mother desperate for her child's affection, but as a woman who finally understood the cost of diminishing herself. The message wasn't a reaching out. It was a reaching for control. I set the phone aside, not with sadness, not with anger, with certainty. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season drifted down, catching the porch light in small, shimmering flashes. I stood at the window and watched them fall, the world growing softer with each passing minute. Change, I realized, didn't always arrive in a storm. Sometimes it came like this, gentle as snowfall, quiet as breath, steady as the turning of a page. And standing there, wrapped in the warmth of my home and the strength I had reclaimed, I understood deep in my bones. I had not lost a family. I had simply stepped out of a story that no longer belonged to me. The day everything settled, the day the storm inside me finally quieted, wasn't dramatic or marked by any grand confrontation. Instead, it arrived on a soft Sunday morning in early spring, the kind where the world feels gentle enough to let you breathe deeply again. I woke to birdsong drifting through an open window, the curtains lifting and falling like slow, steady breaths. The air carried the faintest scent of rain that must have passed overnight, leaving the earth fresh and glistening. I stretched beneath my quilt, feeling a quiet contentment I hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, I didn't check my phone for messages from Michael. I didn't brace myself for demands or apologies, or explanations dressed as accusations. The silence that once felt heavy now felt like space, room to grow, room to simply exist. After breakfast, I drove to the lake house. The gravel crunched under my tires the same way it always had, but something in the sound felt different, lighter, almost musical. When I stepped onto the porch, sunlight filtered through the pines in long, dappled beams. The world didn't feel like memory anymore. It felt like possibility. Inside, the house greeted me with its familiar warmth. The cedar walls, the soft groan of the floorboards, the faint smell of fireplace soot woven into the beams. I walked room to room with slow steps, not out of nostalgia, but appreciation. Each space carried a part of my life, but none of it weighed me down. On the desk in the study, the estate binder waited where I had last placed it, neat and orderly. I set my keys beside it and opened the window, letting in a breeze that rustled the papers gently, almost approvingly. My signature on those pages was more than ink. It was truth. It was self-recognition. It was the moment I stepped back into my own life. Near noon, I made tea and carried it onto the back porch, watching the sunlight catch on the lake in glittering ripples. For years, I had imagined children, grandchildren, running along this shoreline, their laughter echoing into the trees. I had imagined Michael beside them, older, softer, kinder. Some dreams don't come true, but not all unfulfilled dreams are tragedies. Some are simply stories that belong to earlier versions of ourselves. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth settle inside me. A faint breeze moved across the water, carrying with it the distant call of a bird. For the first time, I didn't picture who wasn't there. I pictured who I still was. Later in the afternoon, I drove back into town for my volunteer orientation. The mentorship program met in the community center gym, a bright room with polished floors and echoes that made every voice sound a little braver. A few other mentors gathered in small groups, chatting nervously as they waited. A young woman from the program approached me with a clipboard. Her smile was open, unguarded. "Mrs. Whitfield, we're so glad you're here. You'll be meeting your student next week." There was something grounding, almost healing, about being welcomed without conditions, without expectations of endless giving. Just presence, just participation. When the orientation ended, I walked outside into the tender warmth of late afternoon. Children were playing in the adjacent park, their laughter carrying on the wind. Parents watched from benches or leaned against fences, content in the gentle chaos. I stood for a moment, soaking in the life around me, the kind that didn't demand anything from me, but still allowed me to be part of it. On the drive home, my phone buzzed, a message from Michael. I didn't feel the old jolt of anxiety. Instead, I waited until I parked in my driveway before reading it. "Mom, I heard from Linda. I don't understand, but I guess it's your choice. I'm not sure where we go from here." His words didn't sting. They didn't warm, either. They simply existed, like stones in a river, unchanging while the water flowed around them. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix anything. I didn't feel fear or guilt or the desperate ache for reconciliation. What I felt was clarity. Where we went from here was up to him. My door wasn't locked, but it also wasn't standing open for him to walk through without accountability. Whatever relationship we built next, if we built one, would require mutual respect, not one-sided sacrifice. I set the phone down, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the fading light of early evening. The air smelled faintly of lilac from a neighbor's yard. My porch light flicked on automatically, a steady glow welcoming me home. Inside, I hung my coat and placed my shoes neatly by the mat. The house felt warm, full, lived in, not with memories or ghosts or longings, but with me, just me, and that was enough. I made a small dinner, humming softly as I chopped peppers and stirred rice in a pot. The simplicity of the task felt grounding. After eating, I washed the dishes, dried them, and placed them gently back in their cabinet. No rush, no wait, no one needing me to be smaller than I was. Later, wrapped in my favorite shawl, I stepped onto the front porch and watched the stars gradually appear across the sky. The night was cool, but not cold. A cat wandered across the sidewalk. A distant porch light flickered. Somewhere, a wind chime sang softly. Life continued. So did I. I thought of all the mistakes I had made. All the ways I had loved too quietly or too generously. All the times I had chosen peace at the cost of my own dignity. Those choices shaped me, yes, but they did not define me. People often think self-respect arrives with thunder, with dramatic declarations and slammed doors. But mine arrived like this, soft, steady, unmistakable. A hand on my own shoulder telling me, "You're allowed to choose yourself." And I did. As the sky darkened fully, I whispered a quiet gratitude. To Robert, to the years that had shaped me, to the strength I had finally uncovered. And perhaps, in some distant way, even to the pain, because without it, I might never have found my way back home to myself. I closed my eyes, letting the cool night air brush against my skin. When I opened them again, the stars seemed a little brighter. A new beginning. Simple, steady, mine. And that is how this chapter of my life closed. Not in bitterness, not in triumph, but in peace. The kind that lasts. Thank you for walking this road with me, for listening to the quiet parts of my heart. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you liked it and subscribed for more. And before you go, let me ask you one thing. If you were in my place, what would you have done?